Hi, I'm Ashley Swartz, CEO of Furious Corp. Happy Wednesday. So excited to be back here. This has been one of the highlights of my week. I'm so grateful to have the opportunity to do this. My friends, one of my friends from the UK sent me a list, and all my friends in overseas have obviously been in lockdown longer than we have, and it's typically been a stricter lockdown. And she sent me this lexicon or dictionary out of the crisis. And one of the things she sent me was the Corona coaster. It's this emotional roller coaster that we've been on. So I have to be honest, the last week, I'm trying to be a lighthouse, but I've needed a little bit of light. So all of you that are watching today, if you can send me some good energy, I'm going to give you everything I have, and it's going to be a great session, but I could use a little love today. So if you got some to spare, I'd be grateful. So welcome back. This is our weekly session. This is class 4. Can you believe it? The semester that we don't know when it will end, but hopefully it will be before summer. So we're just going to keep on trucking here. Ultimately, the shared goal of Beet and Furious and sort of the teams and I are really just to bring some light, to be a lighthouse right now, what we're going through as an industry, and provide a little bit of a refresher on the lexicon of TV and video advertising, both for those young and old. They're every Wednesdays at 1 p.m. And then we rebroadcast them and syndicate them on the Furious Corp website, on the Beet TV website, and then through email. So we're excited you're here. What we've been doing the first 4 classes, and this is the final class, where the TV and video advertising dictionary that Furious Corp created, which is on our website, you can go to it and you can shortcut it, put a link in your browser. It's an interactive dictionary, or Andy's made it available. You could download it on the site. So that's really been the companion piece. What we did is we had chunked ultimately the dictionary into different sections and sort of themes, and we've kind of bundled those or packaged those for each of the classes. And today is going to be the last 3 sections of the dictionary that we have yet to review. And then ultimately we'll go beyond that. So just sort of foreshadowing what comes next. We've using the dictionary, it's been great. So what's next? I would love for feedback or thoughts. I have a lot of ideas. There are a lot of things I can talk about. I think everybody knows I love to talk about the economics of television and yield optimization and revenue and inventory management and using data to make better decisions. Those are all things that get me out of bed every morning. And I'm so grateful to have them to drive me to be better, faster, stronger every day. So if you have anything specifically you would like to talk about, I think good and bad, we're going to have a couple more weeks together. And I would love for some programming direction. So that being said, today, class 4, we're going to review 3 areas in particular, right? 1, our traditional TV systems and workflows. I know, slow your roll. You're really excited, thrilling. I get it. I'm gonna help you through it. Control your excitement. The second is we're gonna talk about the jobs and roles and functions within TV buying and advertising value chain. So who does what on what side of the value chain and what kind of role do they play? And then ultimately the future of TV advertising. We'll just talk about some big sort of broad brushstroke things there that could even be some things we want to dive into deeper in the coming weeks. So let's get at it. So traditional TV systems and workflows, many of in our industry, just sort of given where we are right now, are digital natives. There are a lot of people that haven't actually worked in linear television, although and television has become this catch-all, right? It's this collective that includes premium digital video and sort of linear TV. But linear TV, as we talked about last week when we went through the ad tech stack, has a very unique set of technologies and sort of workflows and business processes that have struggled to be automated, right? So amid the sea changes in television, the process of buying linear TV, if we're really honest, hasn't changed significantly since the 60s. And the systems haven't necessarily changed either. We may have sort of added functionality or wrap systems or data around them, but ultimately we're still using the same kind of, engine profile to actually run the machine, if you will. Last week, as I said, we reviewed the ad tech stack, and we're going to go through some definitions today, and I'm going to try and layer some context and just sort of some commentary around it to give you a little bit more of idea, sort of the fluidity between what is television, what was television, what is still linear television, and then how this reimagined definition of television being a more collective about premium long format video delivered over any device or platform. As we sort of go through that arc of change, it's really important to understand the fluidity around the definitions and what we mean when we use certain words in our industry, because sometimes vocabulary gets on our way. So I'll try and layer that commentary on today. So billing and reconciliation obviously is really important, right? Show me the money. So this is the process that media buyers undertake to compare contracts with orders or statements as to what was actually delivered, right? right? And ultimately what ends up happening in linear television is that if something wasn't filled or delivered, this kicks off a process of make goods. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes when I provide the definition of make goods. But this process is different from digital to linear. So, there isn't as much transparency in linear, because what you have in digital is you have both the buyer and the seller within an ad server, actually trafficking a pixel, right, or a tag against an ad, and then the buyer is typically putting the creative into the system for the campaign. And there's a lot of transparency and sort of connectivity. It's actually purely technology that is connecting these two folks. We don't have that workflow automation and workflow integration between buyers and sellers of the value chain on the linear television side to the same extent, right? We don't have standards in that. So that actually creates a system in billing and reconciliation where the typical sort of digital media standard in the US, this is in the US particular, is that kind of the buyer, ad server wins, right? So if it's less than a 10% discrepancy, what is billed is basically what the buyer's ad server said is billed. Doesn't work that way necessarily in linear, and it actually doesn't work like that in the rest of the world, which is very interesting. So, kind of going down that path, let's talk about inventory, right? So what happens in linear, which is really different, is you don't have the same fluidity of inventory as you do with impressions in digital. So in linear, we have these, sort of buckets of inventory that are made unavailable to the general advertising pool in an effort to ensure certain business needs can be met. So first and foremost, what's really easy is that's marketing or promotion. So if you are an MVPD or you are a national broadcaster, you have to capture new subscribers, or you have to minimize churn of existing subscribers, right? You have to retain subscribers or retain subs, as you may have heard. And then on the broadcaster or programmer side, your goal is to actually drive tune-in, because that is an actual performance indicator for revenue, both for advertising and for what are ultimately sort of carriage fees around distribution. You've got to make sure you drive as much audience to your programming as possible. So marketing is a really simple first hard carve out. Other hard carve outs, if we talk about local advertising, particular zone-based advertising for MVPDs in television, that 2 minutes per hour, if you recall. Ultimately, you have, what is general linear. So that's inventory they sell on a zone basis to a lot of small to medium-sized businesses and local advertisers. So that's automotive, for example, as a big category, local dealers, things like that. And then ultimately what you have is you have the interconnect, right? This is a partnership between MVPDs, because not everybody has a national footprint. They work together and share, they sort of sell inventory for one another and on behalf of one another to be able to offer more reach, particularly in zones where an MVPD may have a very, very small subscriber base. You have national, for example. So, you have 3 major MVPDs that are partners and, work with Ampersand to be able to aggregate their inventory and sell national inventory. So that's a hard carve typically, right? And part of that is because the systems actually are not in place that allow for what is sort of visibility and fluidity of inventory, which would kind of be above all the inventory types, to be able to move spots very easily in a dynamic way in order to be able to maximize revenue. So what ends up happening is going into a planning period, which could be a quarterly basis, could be a monthly basis. I haven't not seen this done, carve outs on a weekly basis. What ends up happening is you hard carve these spots and you allocate them and you kind of go forth from there. And that clearly really significantly impacts your efficiency as far as how you're using your inventory. The make good process, which I started to talk about when I was talking about billing and reconciliation. Honestly, this is one of the biggest points of friction and manual work and time suck for linear television sellers, right? So this is, we say sort of ad impressions. This is spots or impressions, however it was, the currency with which it was sold or guaranteed, but, delivered by a seller. In the cases where the number of impressions they delivered falls short. So again, you may not actually have any scurrying to make good or to fulfill what was fell short on digital, but in linear you typically do. And this process of re-expressing and sort of ultimately, scheduling and making sure that units fill or spots fill, especially if there was a window of that campaign and closing that loop, that is a lot of manual work and a lot of friction and a lot of just difficulty. It's difficult because you don't necessarily have a machine or an automated way that is giving you visibility of the inventory and sort of in near real time to be able to re-express where that should be scheduled in order to be able to fill that campaign for its period of flight. It's tough. It's a lot of work. It's harder than it should be, honestly. rate cards are something that are, they exist in digital, but particularly for traditional linear television are still a core, business kind of tool that is used to actually drive the business. So it's a seller document. It's created. It's not given to a buyer. It's not published, right? But it's what they use internally to value their inventory. And honestly, some rate cards are annual. Some are quarterly. We see more of our clients moving to monthly or weekly. But really, rate cards are ultimately prices for a period of time based on how that inventory is sold. So like MVPDs, right? They could be selling by zone, by network, by day part. Local broadcasts can sell by day part or by program, by affiliate station. And then more increasingly, as there's been consolidation of local broadcasts, they are going to try and sell particularly by markets and then even national. What's really important is to understand that when you come to pricing and rate cards, there's a significant difference because what we see is I call it like the Uber Pareto, right? It's not really 80-20, it's like 90-10, where, literally 90% of revenue for television sellers for linear is typically derived from like maybe 10% of the volume of inventory. And that's because high value programming, which is sports, and ultimately sort of, premium episodic prime time, which is what has kind of gone away during this crisis, which is very important to note, is really what drives the majority of the revenue, right? And so that's interesting because you have this anomaly where high value programming in sports is significantly inventory constrained. And so you have a situation there quite often where you are in make goods and you have inventory being preempted, or you have, how that inventory was booked in the systems, the code that was attached to it. It can create this complexity of making sure that when you actually sell a premium spot, it will get delivered. And you don't have that necessarily with the rest of the inventory pool or the 90% of the volume of inventory of spots that remains. So that makes actually sort of one, pricing, and then two, ultimately that balance of inventory management between premium and non-premium inventory, very challenging, right? Ultimately very challenging. And so scheduling becomes more challenging because scheduling is ultimately the specifications buyers put around TV campaigns, right? What days or times they want their ads and they should be delivered. And then ultimately on the sell side, there is a scheduling process where, they call it literally like scrubbing the logs or rubbing longs, where literally a person is sitting and assigning a campaign and a source of demand to a single spot, right? And so if you have multiple sources of demand for a single spot, it's a challenge. And if whatever those sources that we're trying to get in that spot cannot be moved and actually traffic there, that is a situation where you've got to make good, right? Depending on how you've sold it. This particularly is the case for premium or what we call fixed position inventory. So let's talk about the job functions, right? I think the reality about television in general, linear TV, is I've made this metaphor before. It's like, you're racing F1 with a Datsun or a minivan. It's like literally the majority of the decisioning, particularly the decisioning that really more and more needs to be infused by data and driven by data, is reliant upon Excel. There's not connective tissue across the workflows of all those sort of those business functions that we just talked about. There's not necessarily connective tissue that exists there. And then when we look at the jobs and the buying and selling, there aren't necessarily systems that allow for collaboration and these individual job functions to work more closely together and more fluidly sort of integrate, if you will, because ultimately most of the technology are vertical systems that transact. They're transactional systems that do one thing. They do it really well. And that's it. As we said last week, no talkie. That's one of the challenges. So, ad product development is a function that exists within buying and selling of TV. And this really is on the sell side, where what they're trying to do is to create new products, new packages to, take particularly what is often sort of anchor premium inventory of sports or programming or events, right? The Olympics, premieres of, primetime programs that have a large audience in their second, third, or whatever seasons, to bundle that inventory and then create additional units around it, around the spots themselves as the anchors of a package, or create new products, new digital products that may amplify that, et cetera, to really be able to create what is a solution for an advertiser, right? There's a lot of partnership and collaboration with either the agency or the buy-side team in creating these. Audience development is a really important function, obviously much more so for digital. And this is actually pretty significant, right? We look at this, audience development quite often is kind of relegated to the other sides of the business in traditional linear particularly when we look at like an MVPD, their subscriber management, et cetera, kind of the use of that inventory to acquire and then retain subscribers, or for broadcast, driving audience and driving views, et cetera, how to use that in-house marketing inventory and units. Like NBC is the largest advertiser in the world because of the number of units that NBC uses of their own to actually drive programming, et cetera. So audience development is really important, particularly for digital, because premium digital video, over the top, et cetera, this is illiquid. These are still supply constrained platforms, right? And they also have a lot of fraud. So there's a lot of issues around that and that inventory. So a lot of these over the top or sort of AVOD providers need to invest significantly in building audience or building reach, and then ultimately keeping that reach. And not only is it a core business function, a strategic business function known as audience development, it's also really, really expensive for early stage programmer that is pure digital over the top, for example. The CFO, it's my spirit animal. We don't talk about the CFO a lot in advertising, which kind of bums me out. But this is ultimately the person and the business function that is responsible for overall yield optimization, which is the economic performance of an advertising line of business, right? So they approve budget, and they're really responsible because remember, advertising is just a single line of business or a business unit. It's one profit and loss statement, typically in a portfolio business of large publicly traded companies, right? Unless it's a pure digital new business, et cetera. But advertising is just one line of business. And it's quite oftenly, as we discussed with, like, for example, Comcast, it's not always a significant portion of revenue. And it seems to be a decreasingly smaller percentage of total top line revenue, particularly for the national broadcast networks. So that being said, efficiency and maximizing revenue is key. And we really, I think, underestimate the importance of finance, and particularly the ability of a CFO and the CFO's team as it connects with the sales and the advertising business unit, to be able to thread the needle and tell the story and the narrative between how the advertising business is ultimately driving what are KPIs, performance indicators, and metrics that for publicly traded companies, shareholders look at to assess financial health and well-being of a company, like earnings per share, margin, et cetera. Inventory management is a function on the sell side. These folks are really responsible for maintaining and managing inventory, right? So this function is concerned with sellout and clearance. They're not necessarily focused on the revenue impact, because they're really just functional on making sure that there's a unit available. Where's it available? How do we utilize it? How do we maximize, what are sort of pure inventory metrics of performance? So it's not necessarily, because those blinders are on, it's just about inventory and inventory efficiency and inventory metrics. It's not a pure yield function as a standalone. It's part of a larger yield optimization sort of capability, if you will. The invoicing and credit collections is important because on the sell side, right, this process of actually clearing a client before a campaign is served and making sure they're in good standing, their credit is good, they've paid, the credit check has been done, et cetera, and that funds can be billed and collected, dealing with bank transactions, all of that, that's not a trivial activity. And we underestimate the administrative side, particularly of a linear business, and the sort of size and girth of administration involved in billion-dollar ad businesses, which a lot of linear TV businesses are billion-dollar plus. So I think we really need to take into account that the billing and the credit and the reconciliation functions are incredibly significant and labor-intensive within particularly linear ad sales businesses. The marketing and brand advertiser obviously is on the buy side. And, these are a lot of direct-to-consumer brands, more and more. These are large spenders of media. And a lot of direct-to-consumer brands, the reason I call them out is because they are more and more increasingly bringing their media buying in-house. So you have sort of a lot of disintermediation that may be occurring, and the role of the ad agency in the middle is changing, particularly as more and more media buyers are spending against what are business KPIs or metrics. And they may be looking at digital and sort of traditional media in a more universal, uniform way by wanting to understand how they're driving key business indicators like revenue or sort of volume or value or conversion, et cetera, and attribution, in lieu of looking at reach and frequency and buying in continuous silos or vacuums, if you will, as it has traditionally been done. The existence of automated marketplaces and platforms like programmatic has really enabled buyers or the brands themselves to develop these competencies in-house and to acquire these new skills more easily. Marketing and promotions on the sell side is actually responsible for collaborating with advertisers to build partnerships and programs, right, that are a win-win. So a lot of the marketing and promotions work that is done around what we call tentpole events. So the Olympics, sporting events, NCAA, the Final Four, etc. And again, these are not necessarily from the perspective of units or inventory high volume, but they are incredibly high value anchor campaigns and packages that drive a significant amount of revenue and margin ultimately for these advertising businesses throughout the year. A media agency is sort of a value-added person in the middle, right? They're not a reseller in the value chain because they're not actually typically taking a position or reselling inventory itself. But, they have a lot of concentrated buying power, although they're not actually putting themselves at risk by taking a position in the inventory and investing their own money. Their purchasing power and the consolidation within the holding companies, Omnicom, Publicis, et cetera, has actually, creates this power dynamic with the industry that is often why buyers continue to stay with agencies to place their dollars, because they believe that agencies have greater purchasing power with which they can leverage, which perhaps the value exchange is the expectation that the cost savings they get on the media is greater than the amount they spend on the agency to actually serve it, and then combined with the cost of what it would be to bring that function in-house. So that's really the sort of assessment that a lot of brand marketers are going through right now, is that the cost benefit analysis and the ROI on bringing media buying in-house versus keeping it in an agency. Sales operations is really this kind of collective umbrella term, if you will, that describes the function responsible for managing everything from kind of the order to the maintenance, the execution, trafficking, delivery of campaigns, and sort of all the elements, both for linear and digital, right? So this is that collective term and that workflow, if you will. And honestly, every seller is a snowflake. So what sales ops looks like and what it is and the titles and the roles and the job functions, it differs. It's driven a lot by the systems that are in place and how many systems are in place, how integrated those systems are, what role Excel plays, how much is manual, how much power the sales team has within the sales process. Does ultimately sales control price? Do they ultimately determine what gets sold to whom, et cetera? All those things that are cultural as much as they are sort of infrastructure driven, that constellation of what sales ops is differs significantly from seller to seller. The revenue management and pricing function on the sell side is really ultimately responsible for setting prices. And, this is based on demand, market trends, historical value, capacity, avails, all those things. But again, it goes back to what's the culture within the organization? Who has the power? If sales has the power, there's a pricing function and a pricing team, but ultimately sales is going to determine what the price of that unit is based on handshake. So, I think that's really important to matter, is that there's, the idea of authority and accountability in a linear television sales business is very, very interesting. There isn't sort of an arbiter of decisioning, if you will. It is such a relationship-driven business, and so much power lies within the individuals on the team that has typically been there for a long time, i.e. the sales teams. That's why there is so much power related to ultimately the decisions that affect inventory allocation and pricing for linear sales. Sales and sales planning is a function where on the sell side, they're responsible for the relationships that I just talked about, right? So they are out, steak dinners on the golf course, on the phone every day, really building the relationships that lead to the point of a handshake and an order being booked. Trafficking on both the buy and the sell side is responsible for scheduling campaigns, right? So they're associated creative assets, getting everything in, making sure the creative assets are available, so that ultimately a unit, a creative asset gets trafficked at the time to the right spot, et cetera. Because, trafficking systems exist and they're very myopically focused on making sure a creative asset is trafficked to the right spot at the right time, because 2 seconds of buffer on linear TV doesn't work. That's a compromised linear viewing, sort of lean back experience. So, linear television systems are much, much more purpose-built than digital. They do one thing and they typically do it very well. And if they don't do that, everything else in the middle is either done manually, it's manual work, or it's Excel that's used to fill in all those gaps. So yield optimization on the sell side is really responsible for sort of using data to make better decisions, right? So it's about inventory allocation, both at a campaign or a business opportunity, as well as at a portfolio level. So yield optimization would include, for example, inventory allocation across all of those kind of hard carve-outs by sales channel, as well as then what actual units, spots, or impressions, whether it's spots or it is impressions, and how that's all brought together, and that package for a business opportunity to actually serve that, to both maximize the inventory metrics, so efficiency, performance, utilization, sellout, as well as revenue and value on a per unit basis. So yield optimization is not just about maximizing sellout or maximizing your effective, CPM or your average unit rate if you're selling on a spot business, right? It is about ultimately making sure that the entirety of your advertising business, your profit and loss statement for the advertising business as a whole, the top line revenue is maximized, and the profitability of that business is maximized as well. So yield optimization also typically has to involve a lot of automation of business processes and infusing data into that to automate decisions and let the data be the arbiter of truth and ultimately drive decisioning to make sure that those performance metrics overall for the business are maximized. So looking towards the future, right? If I had my crystal ball, if I was at my standing desk, it would be a snow globe with Lenny the llama in it, a little bit of gold glitter. But my crystal ball is telling me there are a lot of big themes we're going to be thinking about in the future. And what's so interesting about where we are right now, I have to say that my thesis has actually changed, right? When we first went into this COVID crisis, I really thought that the shiny new objects of addressable and audience and those things, that there might be a retrenchment towards the things that we know and are familiar, like spot-driven business, traditional linear. But what we're actually seeing as a result is a lot of bullishness towards addressable and audience, and a lot of sort of preparation to come out strong and loud and proud and really drive audience products and addressable advertising for traditional sellers, and then enabling the value chain of programmers, for example, to sell addressable units as well. There is a lot of work being done within our industry right now, and that's crazy exciting. So, towards the future, I think that addressable is going to become, even more significant and more prevalent part of the conversations every day about buying and selling TV. Consolidated measurement is not going away, particularly as we're shifting towards, what is targeted advertising and audience-based buying and selling. We need it. And ultimately right now, the only real consolidated measurement we have is impressions. But how do we unify that across platforms? Who's the trusted third party, right? Whose measurement do we trust? What's that look like? What happens when a buyer wants to come in and buy more in a different way, right? Or using a different currency? That mix of currencies within a portfolio is really hard. One, for a seller to optimize yield, and then two, for a buyer to continue to manage that and their dollars against, ultimately what are currencies that aren't necessarily one and the same. And when they are equivalized, it's as much art as it is science. Performance-based buying metrics are, as I said, are becoming more increasingly relevant, right? And also an increasingly a way of buying. So brands and agencies are eager for TV buying metrics to be closer to what they've seen in digital, to be able to sort of attribute a TV ad to driving sales, right? Or to driving in-store foot traffic, or et cetera. It's not just up funnel brand metric and awareness and consideration as television used to be. They're really looking at TV dollars to drive more and more down, sort of marketing funnel KPIs. And then obviously mobile as well. But I think, what's really interesting here is that it's still this issue of transparency, right? So we talk about wanting sellers to be able to tool and create, and orchestrate their internal processes and workflows and systems to be able to allow buyers to buy on a performance basis, and then to continually optimize campaigns and schedules against that. But buyers are still reticent and not really willing to open the kimono and provide what are ultimately, the methodologies and how they're measuring attribution, how they're measuring, the business KPIs of sales or foot traffic or other things retailers are, et cetera. And so I think ultimately, and they're building their own UIDs and their own device graphs. And so I think that there's still this tension and friction that exists where there needs to be greater expectation management. And we need to make decisions about whether we want a collaborative value chain. We want buyers and sellers to collaborate with a shared set of goals, and ultimately a willingness to pay more when inventory performs, and to compensate sellers appropriately, and to value inventory more when it performs and delivers. And then, a willingness to actually be able to do the work to enhance the value of your inventory by enabling data and closed loop integration, particularly of what are buyers' performance measurement standards into your selling and planning and trafficking processes to deliver higher ROI for buyers. It's a lot of work and there's a lot of shit to get done right now. So I'm not suggesting anyone is being lazy, but it's not even about missed opportunity. It's just about the aperture with which you look at business and collaboration across the value chain. And I think that we need to start being more collaborative, particularly if we want this V to be steep and we want to rise like a phoenix. Unduplicated reach and the unduplicated reach curve ain't going away. Nor is the proliferation of walled gardens. Everybody and their brother is doubling down on bringing their, building their own device graph, their own sort of reach curve across their own platforms, and building, ultimately what is a walled garden of large audiences to be able to sort of create a standalone business, if you will. The desire for buyers to be able to get this, and this is going to be and is the holy grail still. And I don't know how we're going to get there, because I think what's happening is that privacy has complicated the unduplicated reach curve, and the device graph itself has gotten a little bit more obfuscated as far as what the definition of it is and what it means and the value it delivers. If you have a device graph that is populated with UIDs and you could deliver, sort of something similar to your own unduplicated reach curve, I think ultimately still with what is a mix of deterministic and probabilistic, right? If you have an anchor sort of linear television programming solution within that, like Xandr, for example, Facebook's Google, they don't have this. But if we look at what is ultimately sort of Warner Media Company and Xandr, the tempo is still linear and it's still deterministic if we look at it from a device graph perspective. So that being said, there needs to be a lens of collaboration and partnership if we are going to get closer to really being able to buy across multiple sellers within the value chain, and with confidence know that we're not duplicating reach there. Interoperability, right? So vendor systems talking to one another. Talkie, as we said last week. This needs to happen, right? There was some partnership in that, like Mediaocean and Operative are working closer. They're integrating, I believe, using sort of Mediaocean's APIs to try and automate some of that sort of order processing. There's lots of talk about streamlining the negotiation process, the proposal, the order process, all those things. And then at the back end, right? There's double entry, there's a lot of swivel turning, things like that on one side of the value chain. Forget what the duplication of work that's occurring on this buy side and the sell side. So this is just a huge opportunity. And the conversations I've been having, both in Europe and here in the US, is that automation and efficiency are going to be a core focus in the very near future for sellers. And hopefully a lot of this stuff, we will find solutions, and it will force the hand of collaboration in multiple ways, not just in ultimately being able to package and sell and, deliver an unduplicated reach curve, but also just to make everybody's job easier and make us more efficient. The last thing is just data-driven decisioning. So holistically, I think in the future, we need to figure out how in every part of the value chain, we integrate data and we get data and clean data, reliable data more easily to inform decisions and to automate strategic decisions around revenue and inventory and spend more and more. And then most importantly, use data and data science to continuously improve the performance and the outcomes. That's what I get my ass up out of bed every day to do, to try and do better every day, because it's a big, hairy ass problem. It is a Herculean problem. And I think that the entirety of our value chain and our industry will, once we have a sort of a unified perspective that data-driven decisioning is how we want to do business, and we will do business because data is a lie, data is an arbiter of truth. I think that ultimately we will see ourselves hit a tipping point of efficiency and improvement, and particularly then ultimately economic performance will improve radically if we took a consolidated view of our future in that way. So that's class 4. What's next? Obviously 5, but we could talk about the economics of TV. We could talk about, yield optimization, the role inventory and revenue management play, particularly to, the long-term performance of a sell-side business. We could talk about data-driven decisioning and how to infuse data into now, with immediacy, infuse data into traditional systems and workflows to make those teams better, faster, stronger. I always look at things as kind of a crawl, walk, run. So there's a sort of arc of change. So there are a lot of things. I would ask for some feedback. Help me make this as meaningful as possible. And I will do my best to serve you. So, and to be a lighthouse. So light to all, love to all, peace to all. Thank you guys. See you next week. Be well.